Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 309, an interview with Professor Marlene Laruelle. Hey, today we have a special guest, Professor Marlene Laruelle, a research professor of international affairs and political science at the George Washington University and director of the university's Illiberalism Studies program. She's also the co-author of Russia, Great Power, Weakened State, Memory Politics and the Russian Civil War, and author of Is Russia Fascist and Understanding Russia, The Challenges of Transformation. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Laruelle.
Thank you so much for having me today.
You bet. And one of the things I want to say is I was writing a book on Russian history, and my title was Understanding Russia. So you've already taken that one, so I'll have to come up with a new.
Yeah, it's probably not the only book with that title.
I'm sure. My first question is, how did you develop an interest in Russian history, and what particular topics within it are you most interested in?
Yeah, so I began studying Russian language when I was still at school. In Paris in the late 80s, it was the big Gorby mania time, perestroika time. It was really fascinating. And then I began traveling to Russia at the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the first post-Soviet years. And I was interested both by what was happening at that time, but also by history, 19th century, and immigration period. And what was really fascinating for me since the beginning was the kind of ideological construction of Russian identity, its relationship to Europe, its multinationality. So that's what really kind of pushed my personal interest toward this topic and trying to see the continuities since Tsarist Russia up to Soviet time and then post-Soviet period and see the continuities and the differences. So both history and contemporary history together.
Yeah, so the interest I've seen as you say, the continuity of so many things from even the period of the Varangians all the way through the early leaders of Russia, Oleg and Olga and all of them, all the way through Ivan the Terrible, into the Romanovs, and then you have the Soviet era. It seems like there's such a similarity between many of them in the way the people reacted to it and their roles. One of the interesting parts is the role of the Russian people in how they, have their now elect supposedly their leaders, and how they prop up the regimes that are suppressing them in many cases over the years. And what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, there is, of course, kind of very impressive cultural element that seems to send this image of a Russia, that was never able to kind of develop the same way as Western Europe did in terms of kind of individual right and democracy. At the same time, it's a country that has been reforming itself very regularly, right? It has been always alternating period of repression and then reform and then very deep radical transformation. And I think that's kind of permanent hesitation into different way of development is really what is fascinating. And in a sense, that's what we have been seeing also since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Many ways of testing different pathway to develop and to imagine what can be the future of Russia. And then some moment it seems very blocked. It seems like in a deadlock, and then suddenly it will reopen and try other trajectories.
Yeah, you look at the difference between, say, Alexander the Second, the great liberator, and then Alexander the Third.
The third, yes.
Who went, and it's almost like a seesaw going back and forth as we see this. And that's why I give hope after Putin that something good can happen, that there'll be a shift, because that is a historical.
Absolutely. There was always a pendulum. And in fact, the Russian society itself is not as closed as the regime looks like, right? So if we look at the regime, it's one thing. But if we try to stay in touch with the Russian society, in fact, the modernizing aspect are continuing developed, right? So one day or another, they will also reemerge at the political level. It's just not the moment yet.
Yeah, I have hope. for them. I think there's
I
a,
do too. I do
you
too.
know, I've talked to a lot of people and I've lectured at, Rotary clubs and things like that, where people are like, well, they're just going to be this way always. They're going to be the enemy. I said, this is in your lifetime. You remember the us versus them during Reagan's era and, Khrushchev and that. And we tend to think of it in a small term, small time frame. But when we look at the broader picture, because the history of Russia is well over 1,000 years old, and it does have this consistent pendulum going back and forth. And right now they have a problem. They've lost such a great amount of their great brains. I understand over 700,000 Russians have left the country after the invasion of Ukraine. And many of them were the great minds, the computer technicians, the engineers, people like that. But they're always going to be drawn back to their country because there's still a love for their country, their culture, and everything like that. And they want to come back, but they have to wait, in time where that will be, available to them. Uh, One of the most important issues, though, in the world today is, in my humble opinion, is what's going on in Russia today. What we see, the way that Putin's handling things, and the repression of certain groups, the Navalny incident, and that. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are several, interpretation of what is happening now. I tend to be on the side of trying to be as granular and nuanced as possible and to continue to see first the resilience of the regime, right? Its capacity to adapt to new situation that it provoked itself, right? The way it can bypass sanction, the way it can reinvent a way of dealing with the Russian society at the time where they have to send men to war, the way they reinvest in the Russian economy. So they are reorganizing the country, the state, the ideology in a really resilient way, the way they are opening now to the global south because they lost the contact with the West. So I'm always impressed by this kind of dynamism and capacity to adapt, a kind of ad hoc ability to adjust to very rapidly changing context. Of course, the regime has become much more repressive, authoritarian. The ideological pressure put on the society is higher. But still, you still have very small pocket where you still have some kind of gray zone, not really of kind of opposition to the regime because that is very much silent, but kind of space for the brain, for people, for those who are not totally in agreement with the regime to kind of protect themselves. And so my impression is that many Russian citizens have become, reconnected with this Soviet tradition of inner exile. You think something in your kitchen, you say something else when you are in the public space. So people function with this kind of cognitive dissonance between the private space, what you tell to people you can trust, and what you say publicly. And they can manage that kind of contradiction much easier than we would imagine for those of us who are in the West and are not having such kind of dual way of
Mhm.
thinking so much. So I'm really impressed by the way it's still kind of functioning pretty well, even in the current context of the war, and how much the regime can both, protect the middle classes and the upper classes from the war. Moscow, St. Petersburg are kind of blossoming cities now, and sending the rural provincial population to war, right? So if part of the society is pushed to war, the other part is living in a bubble, and it's functioning pretty well. So that, I think, is a kind of impressive way of the regime capacity to manage its kind of repressive policies and adapt them to different social groups.
I'm doing scripts for the series that I'm doing on the Great Purge of 1937 and 30 to 39. And we see the purge of certain people like Mendelstam and Isaac Babel and those intellectuals who would say things in private and, would never write, like Babel never wrote any of the poems against Stalin. He never wrote them down, but he would say them to groups. Unfortunately for him, he trusted too many people, and eventually he was, executed and taken into. But there was still a lot of that under it, even under Stalin, who's far more repressive than Putin is.
Yeah.
there was still that underground of people who would say things very carefully, of course, but they would be, they still had that sense. And so when Khrushchev came into power, it was so easy for them to open up the society because it was already there. It was already existing, this anti-Stalinist, anti-authoritarianism. And I think what you're saying now about under the Putin regime is very, very true. And it's something that I'd like to bring out. And I'm glad we're discussing this because that's my next series is on the Great Purge. Uh,
Mhm.
Interesting when you talk about far right transnational movement. I mean, it's gaining steam in recent years. And what do you believe is really stoking this? And what role do you see Russia and the United States having in this?
Yeah, that's of course one of the great question of the time. And I think there are different ways of looking at that. I think first there is a rise of far right or national populist or illiberal. I mean, there are different terminology to name them more or less everywhere in the Western world, but even in the global South, you can find similar case things about India under Modi, Philippines, Brazil, and so on. So I think what he's telling us is that there is something happening in each country, of course, with different, political and cultural economic combination, where what was seen as classical liberalism is kind of reaching its maximum and it's getting now weakened by different forces. And that's very much homegrown and organic for each country. And then over that, you have kind of transnational connection that are emerging between all these groups. People are traveling, ideas are traveling, books are translated, social media are helping. You have, international conferences, so financial links. And so that is kind of reinforcing what is happening in each country. But for me, the local aspect is the main one, right? It's happening in each country for domestic reason. And then one more layer is added because of this transnational connection. And in the case of this kind of broad West, then US and Russia are the two key players, right? They are the one who had the funds, who had the minds, who had people, very high level kind of place people who have the connection, the ideas, and who are kind of traveling and making the connections. And if you look at what is happening in Europe, inside this kind of rising transnational, illiberal or far right international, then you can identify both Russian and American connection, right? Some groups are more toward the Russia, other toward the US, but some are both, right? Which for us looks weird because we are thinking geopolitically, US versus Russia. But if you think, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary, geopolitically much more turned toward Russia. But if you look at all the think tanks, the universities, all the policy and intellectual production around Orban, it's all Americans. It's run by Americans, connected to US and Anglo-Saxon world. It's really, it has a US flavor. So you can really see this kind of both US and Russia having a huge influence on the kind of the rise of the far right in Europe and trying to shape this kind of transnational links.
And I know we were discussing this last night with our exchange student who's from Sardinia, Italy, and Maloney and her rise, and she's seeing this underground, anger amongst the older Italians versus her younger ones who are looking toward a brighter future instead of trying to be so isolationist. But she also sees the Russian and the United States influence within her country. And as I've talked to many in the change in England, when
Yeah.
the far right, I mean, they got swept out, in their elections. But Orban, we look at this and his coziness with people like Trump and Putin, but they have to also feed their people, and so they have to look at the economy and where that's going. So I think there's a lot of issues going on in this far right movement, and it's again very much like the pendulum in Russia. Historically, we see this. We saw Reaganism, where how powerful that was for a period of
Absolutely.
time, and then
Yeah.
immediately changed after Bush to Clinton, which was a complete pendulum swing off to the other way. And then we went back to the other Bush and then back to Obama. And so it's this sway of time. And we're seeing this throughout Europe, Asia, definitely with Brazil. We saw this with Bolsonaro because we had an exchange student from Brazil
Uh-huh.
staying with us for a number of months. And we saw that and how the young people are torn of what do we do here.
Absolutely.
And, with, as we discussed before, we started with the loss of intellectuals in Russia. When my understanding is over 700,000 young Russians fled the country after the invasion of Ukraine, especially the engineers, the computer techs, and all these brilliant minds, and that they really do want to come back to their country. They love Russia, but the situation right now is difficult for them, and how many people are doing this throughout Europe. Any other
Yeah.
thoughts? Go ahead.
Yes. Several interesting elements you are mentioning, especially the fact that once far right or national populist movement are in power, they need to change their narrative and adapt because now they became the establishment. They need to deliver results. And that is, of course, something that we saw, for example, with Meloni, between what Meloni was saying when she was looking for power and what Meloni is saying and doing once she's in power is quite it's quite different. So that's something really that matters. And also what you say about young people, right? Young people in Europe are mostly not voting, right? That the first political trend is not going to vote. But once you look at those who are voting, you really have two big groups, the far right and the kind of left, if not radical left. It's a very much polarized new generation. And on that, Brazil was a fascinating case of moving from Bolsonaro to Lula,
Yeah.
right? With very totally different domestic politics, but on the international scene, pretty much a continuity in some of the Brazilian strategies, especially toward Russia, which was fascinating. And on what you said about, all these Russians who immigrated, in fact, many went back, but indeed, it's still like more than 500,000 who are abroad. Some have continued working for Russian firms while being based abroad. So it's not totally lost brain, but a large group is still kind of abroad. And in fact, it seems there are still people who try to leave. They just live in better condition, right? They stay in Russia, and if they find a good job, then they leave. But there is still some kind of pendulum between living, staying 6 months in Russia, 6 months abroad, and so on, because so far the borders are open. But of course, for the human capital of Russia, it's a big loss. Plus all the young men who are sent to the front line, who are also lost for the national economy.
Yeah, that's huge losses. And the fact that the Ukraine was able to invade Russia. This is something that I'm going to have a part of a series of the invasions of Russia. People remember Hitler, Napoleon, the Mongols maybe, but not realize there were a lot more invasions into Russia. I mean, Polish, Lithuania, Commonwealth. We had, the ones from the Ottomans would come up constantly, and then the remnants of the Mongols in Crimea and other areas. It was a constant invasion, and it leads to a paranoia. I'm going to be speaking at a large podcasting conference in February of next year. And my topic is the paranoia of Russia and how it's ingrained into them. Part of the reason for the Cuban Missile Crisis was not just the Cuban missiles that were near the United States, but the missiles in Turkey that were pointed toward the Soviet Union at the time. And very few people knew about that, but the Russians, the Soviets were very paranoid that would be used against their populace, and part of their reason for putting those missiles in Cuba was the missiles in Turkey. Even though those were old missiles, they were not going to be used, they were ineffectual, and the United States made the deal. Okay, we'll pull out of Turkey if you pull out of Cuba, and saving the world. But now this paranoia is still there, and I think post-Soviet collapse, where we helped Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and all the Eastern Bloc countries. And then when Russia said, could you help us too? We said, no, you do it on your own. And then there was that, oh, you didn't really care about us after all. And, how do you think that's affecting the rise of Putin, which came, shockingly suddenly, and his gathering of all this power.
Yeah, I think both the way the Soviet Union collapsed, right? The fact that it was managed by the Russian elites largely, and it's really created this kind of conspiracy reading of history, like the elites are not telling us what they are doing in real. So that's the years of the collapse plus the 90s, which were very violent for average citizen in terms of economic transformation, political, cultural transformation, really helped created this kind of narrative of conspiracy, right? Like something is hidden. We are not told the whole story of how things works. That things, I think, were there in the Russian society in a very kind of amorphous way, kind of very grassroots way. And then it got captured by the regime and then gradually constructed as a political culture of conspiracy. And once you are inside, it's very difficult to break it and kind of try to move away from that, because it's really become something that is present everywhere on television, in political speeches, on social media. And of course, social media are by themselves huge amplifier of conspiracy theories. So it will be very difficult to break in the future.
Yeah, I know one of my childhood friends became the president of the first private bank in Russia in the early 1990s. And he would call it like the old wild, wild west of the United States at the time. He had to have 4 personal bodyguards surrounding him whenever he went out. His problem was they had to all be taller than him, and he was about 6'8", 6'10". So he had these 7-foot tall men all around him because of potential snipers and the way it was run. And he eventually left and came back to the United States. But he said it was a crazy time in that period. And
it was very wild and very criminalized way of moving toward market economy. And I think it's something on which the Putin's regime has been playing, kind of reactivating all these painful memories of the 90s for a large part of the population. And it really became the kind of the counter example that the regime is using to secure its own legitimacy, indeed.
Yeah, we saw that in the United States post-Depression era. And we saw the pain that went through, and then also the post recession, the Great Recession of 2008, where we saw this collapse of our economy and bordering on depression. And then you have the reaction to it, far right movement of it. And then the rise of the billionaire class of the United States, which is very similar to the rise of, the groups in Russia.
Oligarchs, yes,
So
yes.
many mirrors between our two countries that people don't really realize.
I totally agree. I totally agree. They are mirror, and it's impressive how little a comparative history you have. Very few people are working on both Russia or Soviet Union and the US and trying to make some comparison. Because I also think there are a lot of mirror games that would be really fascinating to kind of study in parallel.
Yeah, it's, I looked at, I had a professor, Professor Paul Average at Queens College, and in 1976, he said that the Soviet Union had less than 25 years to exist, and we thought he was crazy. We're like, oh, come on, and he says, no, they're economically collapsed. And my brother sent me a book about the financial collapse of the Soviet Union that was printed in 1989, where they predicted that and they looked at the books and said, this can't survive anymore. But their concern was what would happen afterwards. And then the way they dissolved all the businesses and the large government-owned corporations by giving shares to the people. And the people are like, I can't buy food with this. I can't pay my rent. I can't do anything with this. So they started selling it to these oligarchs who would buy up all the corporations for pennies. And it's so similar to the tech giants right now, the Mark Zuckerbergs and the people like that, the Jeff Bezos and all of these, Elon Musk, who rose through this, having things of just pennies on the dollar and then rising into the hundreds of billions of dollars of value. In Russia, though, it's a little different because there's the issue of defenestration, where all of a sudden you have a guy who has an IV and jumps out of a hospital window. And then you find out he disagreed with the Putin administration on something, and so there's those issues going on. But thankfully, that doesn't happen in the United States, or at least we don't think it does. So there
Yeah.
are subtle differences, but again, so many different similarities between our two countries and many of the other ones around the world.
Absolutely. I always thought the kind of, this tendency of interpreting Russia as a kind of weird, object that would be very exceptional. I think on many aspects, there are a lot of things where we should do comparison with some of the Western experience, but also with, global South countries. And in that case, if you look from the global South perspective, Russia is not so exceptional, right? It's not a kind of really weird object. It has trajectory that you can really compare with many other countries in the world.
I think that's one of the things that what I try to bring out in the podcast is the similarities between us, the differences that occur because of our experiences throughout history, but it's also how we are taught the history. And we sometimes are taught as a us versus them always, and not this is a global issue. I have a lot of experience in infectious disease and things like that. We have to understand that we were global in the 19th century, and the Russian flu that passed around at that time that actually eventually would take Alexander III's life because of the kidney issues that he had mirrors the coronavirus, the COVID-19. And at that time, the Russian flu passed around the world in 6 months.
Wow.
It went from Russia to San Francisco in less than 6 months. No airplanes, no cars. This was steamboats and sailboats,
Yeah.
and it still was a global issue, as was COVID-19. During that period, how it circumvented the world and affected all of us. And it's how each one of the countries had to deal with it. Some countries would deny it even existed. We did, our leadership did. Oh, this is nothing. It's just going to go away. Putin did it.
Yeah.
In China, they did that. And the Philippines, Bolsonaro was denying that this was an issue.
Yeah.
But we found out that we are very global. And as you mentioned, social media. If
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
today, we know about it today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And here also the mirror game between, conspiracy theories coming from American social media tradition, kind of reaching Russia, being repackaged in a Russian way, and then sent back to the West. There would be a lot of kind of archaeology of conspiracy theory to be done. And we would find, roots in the US, roots in Russia very often, and kind of it's transatlantic traveling of conspiracy theory.
And then as it travels through Europe,
Yeah.
it's almost
And
like
then, of course,
pipeline. It's like the gas pipeline from Russia into
absolutely.
Europe.
Yeah.
They try to block it, but it still gets through.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to also tell my listeners that the list of your books will be a link to your website, so they can find out more about you and the multiple books that you authored and co-authored. I'm going to have to increase my library space in my guest room so I can read more of them. It's been really fascinating. I really want to thank you for being on the podcast, and hope we can talk again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. It was great.
You bet. And so to my listeners, well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join me next time when we start a new series on one of the most devastating and heart-wrenching periods of Russian or Soviet history, the Great Purge. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.